Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. I'm Smriti Rastogi. World War I was the Great War, a conflict on a grand scale. From 1914 to 1918, it embroiled most of the nations of Europe. Russia, the United States, the Middle East and other regions. The central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary and Turkey were pitted against the Allies, France, Great Britain, Russia, Italy, Japan, and from 1917, the United States. It ended with the defeat of the Central Powers. In the carnage and destruction, the war was unprecedented. World War I was one of the greatest watersheds of the 20th century geopolitical history. It led to the fall of the four great imperial dynasties in Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. It triggered the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and destabilised European society. Ironically, it also sowed the seeds for World War II. More notably, the war marked the exceptional role of the Indian Army that fought with distinction, selflessly in the battlefields far away from home for a cause that had nothing to do with their homeland. Today, In Depth, we commemorate the 100th year of the Great War. In particular, we will look at the contribution of our Indian soldiers in it, the reasons that prompted the massive battle, the battles that were fought, and the memorials to the heroes. Over 13 lakh Indian soldiers served overseas for the British during the First World War. In adverse conditions and limited resources, they fought for the Allied forces. India lost over 74,000 soldiers and more than 65,000 were wounded in the war. While many historians believe that Indian soldiers played a decisive role in the victory of the Allied powers, the contribution of those who were very soldiers has gone unnoticed for 100 years now. In First Report, we take a look at the contribution of Indian soldiers in the First World War. World War I officially began on 28 July 1914. It lasted till 1918. The world saw the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire fighting against the Allied powers, Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan and the United States. India was under the British rule at the time of the World War I. The British declared India's participation without any concurrence from the Indian leaders. However, Indian leaders and freedom fighters eventually supported the British, hoping India will be rewarded for its contribution with independence. Over 13 lakh Indian soldiers fought for the British in World War I. They served in places as diverse as France and Belgium, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Gallipoli, Palestine and Sinai. The Indian Army fought against the German Empire in East Africa and the Western Front. Indian soldiers also contributed to the European, Mediterranean and the Middle East conflicts of war. As many as 74,187 Indian soldiers died during the war. Indian soldiers were among the first victims who suffered the horrors of the trenches in Europe. They were killed in droves before the war entered its second year and bore the brunt of many a German offensive. 69,214 soldiers returned wounded from the war. Nearly 100 million British pounds were gifted by India to Britain to fund its war. Apart from soldiers and money, India provided the British with 1.7 lakh animals, mostly horses. As much as 37 lakh tons of supplies and jute of sandbags were sourced by the British from India. India supplied all sorts of material for the war, including clothing, weaponry including tanks and guns. The Indian regiments were sent to Europe in their tropical cotton drill. Their winter kits did not arrive before dozens had perished from cold and frostbite. Wounded Indian soldiers were not allowed to receive direct care from English nurses and recuperating troops were kept under armed guard in locked camps. Britain even used Indian child soldiers, some as young as 10 years old in the war. Soon after the war broke out, Indian jawans stopped the German advances at Ypres in the autumn of 1914, while the British were still recruiting and training their own forces. Over 4,000 soldiers were killed in the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in France. More than 1,000 soldiers died at Gallipoli. Nearly 7 lakh Indian sepoys fought in Mesopotamia against the Ottoman Empire. Braving all odds, the Indian Army is remembered for one of the greatest victories in the war, the liberations of the Haifa port. 400 lancers of the 15th Cavalry Brigade, led by contingent from Jaipur, Mysore, Hyderabad, Bhavnagar, Baroda, Idar and Jamnagar, attacked the German-Turkish troops and seized the city of Haifa on 23 September 1918. Indians battled the well-equipped Turkish army of 1,500 men with only spears led by Major Dalpat Singh. The Indian army captured 1,350 German and Ottoman prisoners. Meanwhile, Indian casualties amounted to 8 dead and 34 wounded, 60 horses were killed and another 83 injured.
The British nation just did not have the capacity or the capability to take on the German Empire by themselves. They were critically dependent on the Indian troops. The biggest strength of the British Empire was the huge manpower resources available with them in India. At the time when the World War started, the total strength of the Indian army was 150,000. This notwithstanding, quickly the Indian armed forces were expanded in a very significant manner. 1 million troops or 10 lakh troops of the Indian army took part in the First World War, and they were deployed initially in France, Belgium. Subsequently, in addition to that, there were independent brigades formed which defended the vital oil installations, lines of communications of the Britishers.
On June 28, 1919, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the First World War officially ended, but India was denied the promised self-rule. Instead, the British imposed the Rowlatt Act that silenced the press. Political activists were detained without trial and allowed unwarranted arrest on the suspicion of treason. The British did recognize individual efforts of some of the soldiers. Usman Khan of the 57th Rifles became the first Indian to win a decoration during the first battle in the Western Front. And Khudadat Khan received the Victoria Cross in 1914 for continuing to fight despite being badly wounded in a German offensive that wiped out the rest of his battalion. Many believe that Allied powers would have lost the war had it not been for the Indian soldiers. Field Marshal Sir Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army from 1942, asserted that British couldn't have come through World War I and later on the World War II without the contribution of the Indian Army. The New York Times in 1918 wrote, "The world must pay India in whatever India wants, for without Indian products, there would have been greater difficulty in winning the war." But despite such fulsome praise, the contribution of Indian soldiers in the World War I went largely unnoticed and unrewarded. Even when the world commemorated the 50th anniversary of the World War in 1964, there was scarcely a mention of India's soldiers anywhere, least of all in India. It was ironical that the free world, which owed such a lot to the Indian Army for winning its war, withheld India's own freedom and ignored its concerns till the end of yet another devastating global conflict in the form of World War II. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. The battles in the First World War raged not just in the trenches of the Western Front, but in Africa, the Middle East and Asia. Huge armies deployed new weapons to devastating effect. Over 9 million soldiers and an unknown number of civilians lost their lives. Empires crumbled and new world powers emerged. More details in this report. On 4th August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. It became known as the Great War because it affected people all over the world. The war was fought between the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. The Triple Entity, Great Britain, France and Russia. Each of the countries got their troops ready to fight, including the army and the navy. Great Britain, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Russia, each of them ruled many colonies across the world. They wanted to keep their empires strong and saw other countries taking over new territories as a threat. When Germany and Austria-Hungary took control of small countries like Bosnia and Morocco, the rest of the world thought they were being aggressive. Many countries had made alliances with one another. They agreed to protect each other. If one was attacked, the other would defend them. On 28 June 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was shot and killed by a Serbian man who thought Serbia should control Bosnia instead of Austria. Because its leader had been shot, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. As a result, Russia got involved because Russia had an alliance with Serbia. Germany then declared war on Russia because Germany had an alliance with Austria-Hungary, and it followed subsequent wars. On 4th August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany because of its invasion of neutral Belgium, to eliminate any threat from the west before facing Russia in the east. Britain and other great powers of Europe guaranteed to protect Belgium's borders. Belgium appealed to Britain, and Britain declared war. On 7th August 1914, the war in Africa saw the first shots of World War I fired in Africa. British and French forces invaded Togoland, the site of a key German wireless station, Kamina. The Germans destroyed it to stop it falling into the aliens' hands and soon after surrendered Togoland. 23rd August 1914, the Battle of Mons in Belgium was the British Army's first engagement in France. The German Kaiser ordered the destruction of Britain's contemptible little army, and 70,000 British soldiers were attacked by 160,000 German troops. Both sides used quick-firing artillery and machine guns to devastating effect. 5th September 1914, the Battle of Marne. As the German army advanced towards Paris, French and British soldiers counterattacked along the line of the river Marne. 10th October 1914, the Indian Army joins the war. At the Battle of La Bassée in northern France, Indian soldiers joined the Allies for the first time. 31st October 1914, Siege of Tsingtao. In the Far East, Britain had an ally, Japan. British and Japanese forces attacked the port of Tsingtao, a German colony in China. Although the Germans put up a firm resistance, a force of 23,000 Japanese soldiers seizes control. 3rd January 1915, first use of poison gas. Both sides experiment with tear gas in the first winter of the war. 25th April 1915, the Gallipoli campaign. Australian, New Zealand, British, French and Indian troops mount an amphibious landing to take the peninsula of Gallipoli, 100 miles south of Ottoman capital Constantinople. But the Allies are unable to break out of their beachheads and suffer a crushing defeat by the end of the year. 7th May 1915, the sinking of Lusitania. One of the most terrifying new weapons of the World War I was the U-boat. These German submarines patrolled Atlantic and Mediterranean trade routes. A civilian passenger liner, the Lusitania, is sunk off the coast of Ireland by a torpedo fired by a U-boat. More than 1,200 people die, including 128 Americans. 27th January 1916, conscription introduced in Britain. 21st February 1916, Battle of Verdun. This is the longest single battle of the World War I and lasts 9 months. The Germans failed to break through or exhaust the French army. 31st May 1916, Battle of Jutland. It is the biggest naval battle of the war. The British lose more ships than the Germans and fail to destroy the German high seas fleet. But the German navy retreats and remain bottled up in its North Sea and Baltic ports. 1st July 1916, the Battle of Zama. The Battle of the Somme is one of the largest and bloodiest conflicts of the World War I. Nearly 20,000 British soldiers die on the first day. 6th April 1917, America enters the war. 8th November 1917, Revolution in Russia. In March 1917, there is a popular uprising in Russia and Tsar Nicholas II abdicates. Russia leaves the war, signing an armistice in December. In the peace treaty, Germany gains large swaths of Eastern Europe. 21st March 1918, Germany launches the Spring Offensive. With its armies now free from the threat of Russia in the east, Germany mounts a series of major offensives in France in the spring. July 1918, 100 Days Offensive. Bolstered by American troops, the Allies carry out a series of sustained attacks known as the 100 Days Offensive. 11th November 1918, armistice. Before the Allied armies can invade Germany, an armistice is signed, bringing the war on the Western Front to an end. In a train carriage in the northern France, the Germans surrender and agree to withdraw their forces from France and Belgium. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles imposes harsh terms on Germany, forcing them to accept the blame for the war and pay huge reparations. This arguably contributes to the causes of World War II. Battles took place in France, Luxembourg and Belgium, called the Western Front, and in Russia, called the Eastern Front. There was also fighting on land in Italy and Middle East and parts of Africa. Many battles were fought using trench warfare. Long ditches were dug in the ground. Soldiers lived in the trenches and sometimes climbed out to attack. A famous example of trench war was the Battle of Zama, which started in July 1916. Around 1 million soldiers were killed, wounded or missing. Huge armies deployed new weapons to devastating effect. Over 9 million soldiers and an unknown number of civilians lost their lives. Empires crumbled, revolution engulfed Russia, and America rose to become a dominant world power. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. And with that, time for a very short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. The direct cause of World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But historians feel that a number of factors contributed to the rivalry between the great powers that allowed war on such a wide scale to break out.
The First World War is considered one of the longest war spread out over the largest theatres of conflict in human history. World War I was directly triggered by the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife on 28 June 1914. But the assassination itself was simply a trigger that set off the declaration of war. The factors that contributed to the global devastation and destruction were many and long festering. They served to aggravate the rivalry between the great powers. One cause was the Mutual Defense Alliance that allowed two rival sets of powers to be pitted against each other. Accordingly, by 1914, Germany and Austria-Hungary were ranged on the one side. Russia, France and Great Britain were on the other side. In the background raged the many conflicts between European nations. After the murder of an Austrian Archduke by Serbian assassins, Austria-Hungary prepared for war against Serbia, which was allied with Russia. Russia got involved to defend Serbia. Germany, seeing Russia mobilizing, declared war on Russia. France was then drawn in against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany attacked France through Belgium, pulling Britain into war. Then Japan entered the war. Later, Italy and the United States would enter on the side of the Allies. Another significant contributor to the World War I was imperialism, where powerful nations ruled and exploited colonies. By 1900, the British Empire extended over 5 continents and France had control of large areas of Africa. With the rise of industrialism, countries needed new markets. The amount of lands owned by Britain and France increased the rivalry with Germany, which entered the scramble to acquire colonies late and only had small areas of Africa. The increasing competition and desire for greater empires led to an inevitable confrontation that pushed the world into World War I. Militarism also had its share of involvement. The naval and arms race ensured that by 1914, Germany had the greatest increase in military build-up. Great Britain and Germany both greatly increased their navies. Further, in Germany and Russia particularly, the military establishment began to have a greater influence on public policy. Nationalism was another factor. Countries became greedy and wanted to be better than each other. Nationalist groups in Austria-Hungary and Serbia wanted independence. France wanted Alsace-Lorraine back from Germany, who was lost in 1871 Franco-Prussian War. The use of nationalism gave nations false hope and aggressive to win the war.
There were several reasons. One was that Germany was becoming increasingly powerful and wanted to extend its empire. Thought that the rest of the countries were relatively easy for them to take on. The trigger was the assassination of Prince Ferdinand on a bridge in Hungary. He was an Austrian prince who was assassinated, which started the First World War. In addition, there were several reasons other than this. This notwithstanding, as far as I am concerned, I said Indian contribution was a mega contribution, and we were involved in checkmating not only the German Empire but also the Ottoman Empire.
World War I left high casualties with over 15 million dead and 20 million injured. However, the effects are still being felt a century after its conclusion. It was the deadliest war which involved more countries and was more expensive than any other war before it. The weapons used during World War I were also more advanced than any previous war, using tanks, submarines, poison gas, aeroplanes and long-range artillery. It is not surprising that the effects of World War I were still evident. World War I caused the downfall of 4 monarchies: Germany, Turkey, Austria-Hungary and Russia. War changed the economic balance of the world, leaving European countries deep in debt and making the US the leading industrial power and creditor in the world. With all the new weapons that were used, World War I changed the face of modern warfare forever. Social life also changed. Women had to run businesses while the men were at war, and labor laws started to be enforced due to mass production. People all wanted better living standards. New boundary lines were drawn for Austria, Germany and Turkey. Inflation shot up in most countries and the German economy was highly affected by having to pay for reparations. Japan became a powerful country in Asia. With troops traveling all over the world, influenza was spread easily and an epidemic started which killed more than 25 million people across the world.
The result of World War I is very well known. It resulted in defeat of Germany. A League of Nations came into being. Germany suffered as a consequence of League of Nations extreme hardship. There were such restrictions imposed on Germany which eventually resulted in one of the reasons for the commencement of the World War II. Had those sort of sanctions and those sort of restrictions not been imposed, perhaps the Germans would not have risen up again against the League of Nations, and history would have been quite different.
There are many other effects one can attribute to World War I, but the fact of the matter is that after this devastating war, the world would never be the same again. Many historians agree that the World War I created an atmosphere that allowed the rise of the Nazi Party and the start of World War II. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
13 lakh Indian soldiers fought World War I, but history has not been kind to their contribution. But there are some monuments around the world dedicated to not only Indian soldiers, but also soldiers from other countries who fought in the war.
Across the world, there are many memorials dedicated to the memory of soldiers who fought the First World War. India Gate in the heart of Delhi is a memorial to the undivided Indian soldiers who died during the World War I between 1914 and 1921. Located in India's capital, New Delhi, about 2.3 kilometers from Rashtrapati Bhavan, it is located on Rajpath. India Gate is a war memorial dedicated to honor soldiers and pay tribute to those who died or were injured during the war. Today, it's one of the most popular tourist attractions.
It's most unfortunate that this huge contribution of the Indian troops and the Indian nation notwithstanding, There's only one monument made in India, and that too by the Britishers at India Gate, wherein the names of all 74,187 soldiers who died in the defense of the British nation, that time India was part of the British Empire, their names were inscribed. Several monuments should have come up all over India.
The National World War I Museum and Memorial of United States is located in Kansas City, Missouri. It was designated in 2004 by the United States Congress as America's official museum dedicated to World War I. The National World War I Museum tells the story of Great War and related global events from the origins before 1914. The declared mission of the museum and memorial is to be dedicated to remembering, interpreting and understanding the Great War and its enduring impact on the global community. The Neuve-Chapelle Indian Memorial is a World War I memorial in France located in the outskirts of commune of Neuve-Chapelle. The memorial commemorates some 4,742 Indian soldiers with no known grave who fell in the battle while fighting for the British Indian Army in the First World War. The memorial, designed by Sir Herbert Baker with sculpture by Charles Wheeler, is a circular enclosure centered on a tall pillar that's topped by a lotus capital and carved representation of the Star of India and the imperial crown. At the foot of the pillar is a stone of remembrance inscribed with the words, "Their name liveth for even more." The Chhatri is a war memorial in English city of Brighton and Hove. The Chhatri Memorial Service is dedicated to Indian soldiers who fought on the Western Front during the First World War. The 53 Hindu and Sikh soldiers who died in Brighton Royal Pavilion were cremated on the Sussex Downs and their ashes were scattered in the sea in accordance with their religious rites. Chhatri was built on the exact spot where the bodies were cremated. The Menin Gate Memorial to the Missing is a war memorial in Ypres, Belgium. Designed by Sir Reginald Blomfield and built by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the Menin Gate Memorial was unveiled on 24 July 1927. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And that's all we have for you in this edition of In Depth. Thank you for watching.